The Berlin Wall fell just 202 days following the release of the Nintendo Game Boy. In the late 80s, a Dutch-American-Japanese man by the name of Henk Rogers would risk everything by making a deal with Nintendo to travel to Moscow to secure the rights for a newly popular puzzle game. A puzzle game that would spell trouble for IP rights in the Soviet Union: Tetris. If you've never played Tetris before, it's a pretty simple yet extremely addicting game. The concept of the game is you have to alter shapes that are made from 4 blocks, and there's a whole bunch of different shape sizes, and basically you just have to align them to create lines on a square grid. Every time you create a line, the line gets deleted and the blocks move down, and you keep playing until you can't fill any more blocks. The title is derived from tetra, which is the Greek word for 4, because of 4 blocks, and tennis, which was the creator's favorite game. And in Soviet Russia, nobody owned anything. I mean, technically everybody owned everything, but the government owned everything. So if you created something, if you invented something, you didn't own that. The government did. So when a Soviet computer engineer created a puzzle game in 1985 to keep him and his coworkers occupied during slow work days, you can imagine that Alexey had a hard time sharing his game with the world. So meanwhile in Japan, you have Gunpei, who was the creator of many successful Nintendo toys before they ventured into video games. And if you want to see my video about him, go check it out right here. But he was meeting with Hiroshi Yamauchi, the president of Nintendo, about creating a handheld console with interchangeable cartridges. Now, he had already created the highly successful Game & Watch games, but if anybody's ever played on a Game & Watch, you know it's one game. That's all you get. It's a little small console, and it's one game. The idea that he had was essentially the same concept, handheld game, but with interchangeable cartridges, so you wouldn't just have the one console. Yamauchi was skeptical about this idea, but he trusted Gunpei Yokoi. The man never misses, so he figured, go out and go make this console, right? Yokoi worked with another designer, Satoru Okada, and they did not get along at all. They had many disagreements over this console, which at the time was codenamed the Dot Matrix game, which was based on the dot matrix display of the console. I don't know what a dot matrix display is, but just know it was different from the Game & Watch console. So the type of display that they had is why they called the console the dot matrix game. So now we're going to put a pin in that and go back to 1984's Japan and meet up with our friend, video game designer Henk Rogers, who had just released his game, The Black Onyx. The Black Onyx was a pretty successful game for him and his company, Bulletproof Software. And 4 years after its release, he actually released a port. So it was a computer game at first, but then he released a port 4 years later for the Famicom under the name Super Black Onyx, and he updated the game and essentially redesigned it specifically for the Famicom. So after that game's release in 1988... Henk Rogers was looking for a new game to market. Well, that's when he met with a representative from the company Spectrum Holobyte in hopes of obtaining the Japanese rights to the game Tetris. So now we're going to put a pin in that and go back to 1985's Russia and meet back up with our friend Alexey Pajitnov. So Pajitnov's new game was super popular in his office, and it even made it all the way to Moscow's Medical Institute when a friend of his asked him to give him the game. And, I mean, this game spread like wildfire over Russia. It quickly became probably the most popular game in Russia in 1985. And it actually got banned from the Medical Institute for being too addicting because it was decreasing productivity. Apparently, and this is from Soviet Russia, so, you know, take it with a grain of salt, but apparently people were playing it too much instead of working, and so they banned the game, blocked it from the computers so people could work, I guess, and it increased productivity. Well, eventually, Pajitnov had actually hired a high school kid who was like known for working with computers to help him port the game over to an IBM computer, because the Electronica 60 computer that he originally created the game on was a piece of shit. It didn't even have a graphics card. His game was literally brackets instead of shapes. So he wanted to adapt the game to have shapes, to have graphics, colors. And so this kid helped him port it over to an IBM computer where he could add all of those things and even port it on floppy disks so it would be easier to share. So now with it on an IBM computer, he was finally ready to share his game with the world. There was only one problem though. Pajitnov had no idea about the world outside of the Soviet Union. Okay, now put a pin in that. I know we're putting pins in a lot of different things here, but we're going to put a pin in that. We're going to take pins out. It's all going to like connect together, I promise. So now we're going back to Japan. Shigesato Itoi, another game designer at Nintendo, was actually credited with coming up with the name Gameboy, but at the time, because the game just got such poor reception within the walls of Nintendo, that they jokingly called it the Dame game, where Dame means like useless or helpless. But you know, our boy Gunpei Yokoi, he was hard at work on this game, and he actually developed a very key feature for this new console. He ditched the joystick and instead put in a flat 8-way directional control pad, otherwise now just referred to as the D-pad, as he saw joysticks limited the portability of handheld consoles. Now that I've kind of set up the background of everything that's going on, we can start taking our pins out and everything can start connecting together. So let's go back to Russia. So in 1986, Pajitnov had met with his supervisor, Viktor Bajrabrin, who had knowledge of the outside world of Japan, and he wanted to talk with him about, essentially exporting his game outside of the Soviet Union. So what Bajrabrin did was he sent a copy of Tetris to the Hungarian video game developer Novatrade, and it started spreading. It started in Hungary, and it went as far as Poland. And this is where we meet our villain of the week, Robert Stein. Robert Stein was a salesman for Andromeda Software in London, and he was on a trip to Hungary looking for new games when he stumbled upon this game, Tetris. Well, he was meeting with Novatrade, and they told him, like, hey, we don't own this game. It's owned by these guys in Russia. So he reached out via fax, by the way, which even for the time period was totally out of character, but it was also Soviet Russia, so you couldn't call people. You had to fax them. So he faxes Bajrabrin and Pajitnov about licensing their game. And they send a fax back talking about how they would be excited to make an agreement with him. Well, because Robert Stein, as you'll see, is a bottom feeder, he took this as a contract. It was not a contract. He did not have the rights to the game. But he went to the CES in Las Vegas anyway. And he tried to sell the rights to different publishers. A lot of publishers were like really skeptical because, come on, what American or what publisher going to an American conference is going to buy a Russian game, a Soviet game? It was just absurd to think. So he was pushing it around, and he actually ended up leaving Vegas with 2 contracts. One was for the European rights that he had sold to the giant Mirrorsoft, not Microsoft. I get those confused all the time. Mirrorsoft. The second contract was for the American rights to Spectrum Holobyte. See? Now it's all starting to come together. So despite these contracts being invalid, as Stein still hadn't made an agreement with the Soviets, he sold these rights anyway, and he sold the rights to the 2 companies for a combined £3,000 and 7.5 to 15% in sales royalties. Now, the game did receive an overhaul in the United States because obviously it was a Soviet game. But it did keep a lot of its Russian charms. There were like Russian park backgrounds that they kept in there. And they even continue to package it in red packaging with Cyrillic text, which you just didn't really see on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And in January 1988, Tetris was released in the United States, and it was pretty successful. Within its first year, it did over 100,000 units, and it even won several game publisher awards. So now, with the ever-growing popularity of the game, Stein had a problem on his hands. He still did not own the rights to this game, and so he tried to reach out to Pajitnov to get these rights. But Pajitnov didn't own the rights either. So contract negotiations were taken over by Elektronorgtechnia, or L-Org for short. They made it really easy, even though that is the dumbest shortening for a long name of L-Org. I keep wanting to call it Elgor, but it's not Elgor, it's L-Org. And L-Org was the Soviets' organization for the import and export of computer software. So that's why they took over the contract negotiations. And Stein had actually made several trips back and forth from Moscow. By May 10th, 1988, Robert Stein would finally sign a 10-year worldwide licensing agreement for all current and future computer systems for Tetris. Editing Dylan here, I just wanted to emphasize the fact that Robert Stein had only signed for the computer rights to Tetris. It's going to come up later. I just want to emphasize that now because I forgot to emphasize that, and later you're going to be like, why didn't you emphasize that? Anyway, back to the video. Pajitnov would not see any commissions from his game, but he was very humble at the time, and he even said that just the fact that so many people enjoy my game is enough for me. And that's kind of sweet, you know? He very humble, very nice man, but also, nah, man, get your bag. That's your game. Other people are profiting off of your creation. Like, go get your bag. Communism, am I right? Okay, so now we can take the pin out of Henk Rogers. Yeah, but you didn't know. I literally physically put a pin in Henk Rogers. He's been in very much pain for this entire video, so we're going to take that out of him. So he's not in pain anymore, and we can talk about him. Now remember, in 1988, he had just purchased the Japanese computer rights from Spectrum Holobyte. Now, shortly after this agreement, Mirrorsoft had sold the arcade rights to Atari-owned Tengen, who in turn sold the Japanese arcade rights to Sega. And Tengen would also sell the Japanese console rights to Rogers' Bulletproof Software. And eventually Rogers would release Tetris on the Famicom through Bulletproof Software. I hope you're following along so far with everything that's going down, because it's about to get even crazier. Because now at this point, about a dozen different companies claim to own Tetris in one way or another. And L-Org is about to find out the definition of the word stiffed. Oh, and Mikhail Gorbachev himself would step in on the Tetris fight. By the way, be sure to like this video if you're enjoying it so far, and subscribe so you can see more content like this from me. So Hiroshi Yamauchi, who was close friends with Henk Rogers, sent him to America to meet with the president of Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa, so he could pitch Tetris, because Yamauchi felt like Tetris was the perfect game to be the flagship game for the Game Boy. So all parties were on board with packaging Tetris with the Game Boy. There was one problem, though. Henk needed to secure the handheld rights to Tetris. After a failed attempt at securing the handheld rights from Atari, Henk went to Robert Stein himself, and in November of 1988 had actually signed a tentative agreement for the handheld rights to Tetris. But Stein would need to go back to Moscow to secure the handheld rights from L-Org first. Well, then Henk finds out that Robert Stein made an agreement with Atari to sell them the handheld rights. Remember, he tried to go to Atari to get the handheld rights and didn't hear anything back, so he went to Stein, and now Stein is trying to give the handheld rights to Atari, despite having already made an agreement with Rogers. So Rogers, very clearly seeing this as a breach of contract, just decides, you know what? I'm not going to go through Atari. I'm not going to go through Robert Stein. I'm going to go to Moscow myself to make a deal with L.org myself. But there was one problem. At the time, if you wanted to do a business meeting with any Soviet organization, you needed to have a business visa, which often took months to apply. And that's time Henk just didn't have. So he figured he'd go over as a tourist and meet with L.org. By the way, this was highly illegal, and he could have ended up in Soviet prison. Like, if they wanted to persecute him, they could have thrown him in Soviet prison the minute he stepped foot at L.org. And you can't even if you have a business visa, you can't just show up to a Soviet organization uninvited and unannounced. But Henk needed to secure these handheld rights. So he did exactly that. And I would call this a bit of tragic irony. Robert Stein actually had a meeting with L.org that same exact day. Also, having a meeting that same exact day was Kevin Maxwell, the manager of Mirrorsoft, who was trying to secure the handheld rights to Tetris himself. None of these men communicated with each other prior to this meeting. That's kind of how tight the schedule was to get these handheld rights. Now, the president of L.org, Nikolai Belikov, was shocked when Rogers showed him a copy of Tetris for the Famicom. And L.org accused Rogers of illegal publication because, again, if you missed it earlier, L.org sold the computer rights, the worldwide computer rights, to Robert Stein. They didn't sell him arcade. They didn't sell him console. They strictly sold him the computer rights. So, as far as they were concerned, this was an illegal game. And Henk Rogers was the one committing the infringement. Rogers explained that he received the console rights from Atari Games, who bought them from Mirrorsoft, who bought them from Robert Stein. And L.org, especially Nikolai Belikov, quickly figured out this web of lies that Robert Stein had created, and the hole he was digging for himself with his numerous, essentially illegal contracts. During his time in Moscow, Rogers had actually befriended Alexey Pajitnov, who helped him in talks with L.org. Rogers was able to convince L.org to sign over the handheld and console rights to Nintendo. Nikolai Belikov also convinced Robert Stein to sign an updated contract that would give him arcade rights, but it also redefined the word computer to include anything with a screen and a keyboard. This effectively, obviously, eliminated any handheld and console contracts that Stein had made, giving the handheld and console rights to Nintendo. So Rogers flew back to the U.S. to meet again with President of Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa, and got him to agree to a contract to have L.org sign over the console and handheld rights to Nintendo for $50 million plus 50 cents per cartridge sold. Editing Dylan again. So Nintendo had actually bought the rights for $500,000. The movie Tetris on Apple TV Plus said it was $50 million. That's why I got confused, but the official price was $500,000. So in March 1989, Nintendo had sent a cease and desist letter to Atari-owned Tengen because Tengen had released Tetris for the NES. So Atari turned to Mirrorsoft and was like, what the hell? I thought we had console rights. And Mirrorsoft was like, you do have console rights. I don't know what's going on. So Robert Maxwell, who is the father of Kevin Maxwell and the CEO of Mirrorsoft, called up his good buddy, Mikhail Gorbachev, and told him to cancel Nintendo's contract. So Gorbachev had threatened L.org president Nikolai Belikov to cancel Nintendo's contract. And Belikov refused, acknowledging that the best financial decision for the Soviet Union was to sign the contract with Nintendo. And there's so much to why the Nintendo deal is the most lucrative deal. Basically, Microsoft had no money. Robert Stein was about to die of mysterious circumstances, and his son was going to be not convicted of fraud. He was eventually acquitted of fraud, but arrested for fraud. If you kind of want to know, like, the really in-depth of these contract negotiations, I highly recommend watching the movie Tetris on Apple TV Plus. It was actually executive produced by Henk Rogers and Alexey Pajitnov, and it is probably one of my favorite films of 2023. Highly recommend you go check that out. But since Belikov refused to cancel Nintendo's contract on June 15th, 1989, a lawsuit began. Atari Games sued Nintendo over the rights to Tetris. Atari made the argument that since the NES was just the international version of the Famicom, which literally stands for Family Computer, then technically the NES, by definition, was a computer. They also argued that the Famicom was intended to be a computer via the expansion port, which, if you want to see a whole video on why that argument actually kind of holds water, go check out the video I did on the NES right here. Nintendo had actually brought Pajitnov and Belikov to testify that the original contract was only meant for computers, like home computers, and that the revised contract that Stein signed, say that 3 times fast. Stein signed. Yeah, see, I can't. But the original, the revised contract that Stein had signed clearly defined a computer as having a monitor and a keyboard, and was not a console like the Famicom or the Nintendo Entertainment System. So on June 21st, 1989, Judge Fern M. Smith ruled that Spectrum Holobyte and Mirrorsoft never obtained console rights, and therefore ruled in Nintendo's favor. So the next day, Tengen had took their version of Tetris off the market, and it left many warehouses just full of games that they couldn't sell, which was kind of reminiscent of the whole E.T. debacle that had happened 6 years earlier, right before the video game crash. And it's actually interesting because Sega was planning on releasing a console version of Tetris in Japan. But during the whole legal battle, they'd put it on hold and ended up canceling it altogether. And fewer than 10 cartridges ended up being developed. So you could say that Sega's version of Tetris on console was probably the rarest video game never released. So now, with all legal battles over, Nintendo of America finally released the Game Boy in July of 1989. It was followed by the Japanese release in April of 1989. But the Japanese game was not packaged with Tetris. The American version was. So now you're probably wondering, what the hell happened with Alexey Pajitnov? Well, the Western world was quite fascinated with Alexey, and he actually got his first glimpse of American culture in January of 1990 when Spectrum Holobyte flew him out for the Consumer Electronics Show. And after this, he did a tour of America and just absolutely fell in love with it. He did numerous interviews. And of course, they brought up, the fact that he never made a penny from this extremely successful game. And again, he stayed humble. He was super humble about it. He said, that he was just happy that everyone was enjoying his game. So you're probably wondering, he got his bag though, right? Yeah. Yes. So, it took a while. It took way longer than it should have. In 1996, the rights were reverted back to him from the Academy based on an agreement he had made with them in 1986, and an agreement that was reaffirmed through Henk Rogers. So that same year, Henk Rogers and Alexey Pajitnov founded the Tetris Company to control all the licensing rights for Tetris. By 2002, they had purchased the remaining licensing rights from L.org, which at this point was a private company, obviously because of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The legal battle over Tetris definitely emphasized the ever-growing issue in the Soviet Union over democracy and commercialization. While the dissolution of the Soviet Union was extremely complex and it was this ever-connecting web of different circumstances and different events, I think for sure Henk Rogers, Alexey Pajitnov, and Nintendo definitely changed the public opinion on IP rights within a communist society. And despite much skepticism, Gunpei Yokoi struggled again. I told you, he never misses. This dude was a freaking janitor at Nintendo, and he's like one of their best game developers. It's insane. So the Game Boy is released in 1989 and holds the record for the best-selling console of all time until it was overtaken in 2000 by the PlayStation 2. Then it held the position of best-selling handheld console until 2006, when it was overtaken by the Nintendo DS. And as of 2024, it is still the fourth best-selling console of all time, just behind, obviously, the PS2, the Nintendo Switch, the Nintendo DS, and the Game Boy. Obviously, there was the release of the Game Boy Color, but that I could do a whole video on just the Game Boy Color alone. And if you want to know more about the history of Nintendo consoles, check out this video right here, or check out this recommended video, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!